Hello and welcome to the Transforming Society podcast, where I'm joined today by Jon Allsop, the author of What is Journalism For? Jon writes in the media for the Columbia Journalism Review and has contributed to a host of other publications, including The Guardian, the New York Review of Books and The New Yorker. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wondered, when you meet someone for the first time, perhaps at a party, and you're trying to explain to them what you do, what's the sort of succinct version of what your job is, and how do people normally react?
Depends who I'm talking to, I guess, a little bit. But I sort of wear, I say I'm a journalist. I sort of wear lots of different hats within that. Like, I guess the kind of stereotype Hollywoodish view of a journalist is, wears a kind of pork pie hat and runs around in a trench coat with a little notebook and sort of, receives envelopes smuggled between gloved hands in parking lots or whatever. That's not really what I do. I sort of do a weird combination of like analysis, opinion journalism, reporting, features, magazine writing, I guess, is probably a less grandiose way of putting it. But it does sort of straddle these different kind of types of journalism. So yeah, depending on the crowd, I think there's a chance I might say that I'm a writer or essayist or journalist. I think these are sort of fairly interchangeable terms for what I specifically do, I would say.
Yeah, and now of course you can write author of books into the mix.
So.
Yes. But one of the key things you do is you reflect on the media. So you're actually a journalist who spends quite a lot of their time reflecting on what journalism is and does in the world today.
Yeah, I guess critic would be another word that I could add to the sort of panoply of ones that I just mentioned. Yes, so I, for the last, 6 or so years, have written and overseen a newsletter for the Columbia Journalism Review, which, for those who don't know, is a New York-based magazine based at Columbia University, but not sort of the university. It's not in any way a student-run publication. It's sort of a professional magazine. And what we basically cover the world of journalism and media, and I think we take quite a broad lens on that question. But yeah, a lot of what I do is a combination of critiquing media coverage, the way the media is engaging with a specific topic, and sort of using that as a lens to think about how we, all see the world. I guess that sort of strain of it is particularly about US politics, but not exclusively. And then I sort of do reporting on the experiences of journalists, not just in the US, but all around the world, stuff to do with press freedom, stuff to do with the business models of journalism and how they are and particularly aren't working at this moment in time. I think it's sort of, like any other magazine that you would read, but sort of laser focused on the world of journalism and journalists themselves, which sounds to some people like insider baseball, but is actually super interesting and I think, super important. Journalists can be kind of allergic in some cases to scrutinizing themselves or thinking that they are the story, even though most journalists do love to talk about themselves. But I think that's profoundly wrong-headed. It's a powerful industry, and yeah, it deserves coverage and scrutiny and criticism, just like any other.
Yeah. And that's how I first became aware of your work, because I read that newsletter and I was really impressed by the range and how you were not just encapsulating the stories of the day, but actually reflecting on how they were being reflected in a very wide range of journalism in the US, particularly, as you say, in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. And I wondered, when you get up in the morning, what is your your journalistic diet? What is your routine because you're not, as I say, you're not just writing about one story, you're writing about how that story is playing out in manifold different avenues of the media. So how do you actually approach that task? Because it seems to me that knowledge and that breadth of vision kind of plays into the book that we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah, I like to think that, the newsletter that I do and my work in general does take this kind of broad lens. I think that a lot of journalism can become kind of insular, especially in the US context, honestly. And so one thing that I've been doing particularly for the last couple of years is this newsletter on Tuesdays that tries to sort of take debates and themes and topics that are, very kind of the moment in the US, but rather than just writing like the typical, here are some bullet points you need to know about this thing in a US context, it's trying to say, well, is this playing out in the media industry in a different country that, our readers who are mostly, if not exclusively in the US, might not know about? One example, for instance, would be in 2023 that when there was this big kind of furore over Donald Trump and Joe Biden's handling of classified materials, it sort of led to this questioning of whether overclassification, i.e. the idea that just way too much information that should never really be classified gets classified. It sort of led to a conversation about how that's a big problem. And it just so happened that this kind of seemed to dovetail a little bit with this press freedom story I was seeing out of Finland, which had to do with journalists being arrested for publishing classified information, even though it was information that people were saying shouldn't have been classified, and even though Finland is by some metrics the best or one of the best countries in the world for press freedom. And so I was able to write something that was like, actually Finland is having this same kind of issue as well. And I think it sort of helps to create a sense that this is actually a connected world, not only, but obviously a connected kind of media sphere within that. And hopefully that sort of brings an outsider's perspective, because obviously I am British, so this is kind of a strange perch for me to be writing about US stuff. So I think trying to bring that kind of broad sensibility to it is what I aim for. In terms of media diet, I think maybe that's sort of evolved over the years. I mean, I read a lot of newsletters just because things like Politico Playbook, for example, I might not always agree with the way they frame things or the way they kind of prioritize the political topics of the day. But one thing I know that they will always do is have a really thorough rundown of what's in all of the major US newspapers, right? I sort of liken it to kind of being like a bird. You're sort of like flying over the information landscape, as it were, at quite a high level. You're not seeing things in a ton of detail necessarily, but then you might see one thing that catches your eye and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And then you kind of dive bomb and you can then dig into that, and maybe that then kind of like becomes a story. So I try sort of to operate at both those levels. I try and write things that have a kind of bit more of a 50,000 foot view, like how do all these kind of pieces, without going into a ton of detail on all of them, how do they sort of fit together into a way that we might think about the world and how the media is covering it. But also sometimes, I might see, a tweet or an email notification about a press freedom case in Finland, and I might think that's really interesting and go and talk to the people involved. And I try and sort of take that dual approach. And like I said, an international one too. I mean, I read Le Monde in addition to the New York Times every day, for example, at least just at the headline level, to try and get a broad sense of what's going on in different places.
Yeah. So I guess in some ways all that experience made you very well suited to writing this book. But I also imagine you had to kind of change your optic a bit so that those skills were useful, but you had to sort of take a different kind of view of the terrain in order to tackle it as big and general a question as what is journalism for. And you decided not to just sort of roam around the world and 2 pages on China here or 3 pages on Russia there. So how did you actually decide what kind of vantage point and what kind of approach was going to make sense for writing a longer treatment?
Yeah, well, obviously, as you know better than anyone, this is a series, and so the title of the book is kind of defined, right? Like the lens of the book is defined. You handed that to me and said, do you fancy having a go at it? So it wasn't a question that I had necessarily come up with, or even, I mean, I guess I had been thinking about it just because it ties into everything that I do, but in this kind of bigger, overarching philosophical way. I hadn't necessarily thought about how I would sort of construct an overall answer to that. And I think I knew pretty quickly that even though I'd never written a book before, the longest thing I'd written before being about 10,000 words, which is long for a piece of journalism, but not, book length. But I think it became apparent pretty quickly that the issue here was going to be space limitation, not, oh my God, how am I going to write 35,000 words as opposed to 10,000, right? This is a question that you could just take in innumerable directions, and I hope I'm very clear in the introduction to the book to say that this is a very subjective question. It sort of depends on how you define the terms. Even my answer right now might be totally different to how I would answer this question in 10 years or 10 years ago, right? It's something that is kind of changing. There's a great quote in the book from a great American media critic called Jack Schaefer to the effect of like, it's a question that's buried in so much magma and bedrock that it's hard to even get at. So yeah, even though it ties into things that I write about and think about on a daily basis, you're right, I had to take a different kind of lens, to step back and think about it in a more sort of overarching way. And Yeah, I think basically it was a question of, on the one hand, trying to think back through things I'd written over the years, through debates that I'd kind of accessed through kind of, specific stories in the US context or whatever, and try and pull out, what are the sort of philosophical principles here that I think are important, and how can I use these and other examples to sort of illustrate that in an engaging way. Um, I also, and obviously journalists like to tell stories through characters and narrative arcs. I think there's definitely a version of this book that could have done that, but I think it would have been complicated. I think this is sort of a quite an overviewy book. It's a book that I hope is deft and pacey, but not one that sort of tells like a spy thriller type story. But at the same time, I think you do want to have some sense of groundedness, some sense of place. You can't, I think, do 35,000 words on a topic this big and confusing and contested and not have it kind of grounded in at least some sense of place. So I sort of started thinking about, well, I'm definitely going to write about US journalism because that's what I write about mostly, and that was where I was trained as a journalist. I sort of mostly still work for the American press. British journalism obviously makes sense as a slight counterpart to US journalism. It's a similar tradition, but there are differences. I'm obviously from the UK, so that sort of makes sense as well. But then I was thinking, it was important for me to sort of step out of my comfort zone and to write about a different part of the world that would be something that maybe I was familiar enough with that I knew it would be interesting. Like I wasn't sort of going down a dead end, but at the same time would challenge as I was going sort of my assumptions or the kind of framing of what is journalism for as a question in those countries that I'm most familiar with. And I initially actually looked at Myanmar and Tunisia because I had written a little bit about the media ecosystems in both those places for the Columbia Journalism Review, and they're both super interesting because they're countries that have had a pretty recent period of democratic, to some extent, opening, of a growth of press freedom from a baseline of quite restrictive conditions for the press that have then gone sour to differing extents. I think along the way, it increasingly made sense to kind of focus on one rather than both of those for reasons of, length and complexity. So I ended up really drilling down on Myanmar, which I think, is just a fascinating country generally and from a media point of view, one where a brutal coup in 2021 has been dreadful for what was a kind of burgeoning independent media sector there. And it's something that really, I think, doesn't get enough international attention these days in light of, all of the other crises going on around the world. So, yeah, I felt that was kind of a good example to drill into in addition to the ones I was more familiar with. And then it was just about kind of fitting the ideas around people and the things that, the things journalists have to do in every story they tell.
Yes. And you decided you were going to interview several dozen journalists in those three countries. And when you told me about that, I remember thinking, what a brilliant idea. And then I thought, but isn't that just going to present him with an overwhelming amount of material, which, of course, was underestimating your skills as a journalist. And I think probably I was thinking about academics who might then tend to spend a long time trying to sift through and sort of analyse that data. But it seemed to me you were very good at sort of picking out very telling and pertinent things from those conversations. But tell me a little bit about those conversations. Did you go to them, all those journalists in those different countries, with the same set of questions? Were you interested more in the sort of philosophical meta questions or the practice, or how did you actually approach that process of speaking to fellow journalists?
Yeah, so I basically decided that I would do like 10 interviews per country that I was focused on. And this was sort of initially when I was thinking about looking at Tunisia in addition to the others as well. But this wasn't, and I should be clear, it's not like an academic book. This is not kind of a, comparative analysis. It's not a survey. It's data in the sense that everything is data, right? But it's not data in the sense that I'm making a claim that this is kind of a rigorously selected group of interviewees against some sort of social scientific baseline that says something that is absolutely true about the nature of what journalism is, if that's even possible to do. But it was, I wanted to sort of have a population that was relatively limited, that I knew I would be able to sort of do alongside my other work. And I think I wanted to sort of have longer conversations with well-chosen people, as opposed to just sort of calling up every single journalist I've ever spoken to, or sort of throwing out requests and seeing who got back. So again, it wasn't kind of academically rigorous, but there was a degree of like thought that went into the selection of these people. I think particularly in the US context, I obviously know a lot of journalists over there. I wanted to choose people who I knew would have a range of different perspectives on the question from, Jack Schaefer, who I mentioned, who is kind of a bit libertarian-y and certainly a contrarian when it comes to lots of kind of media ethical debates, through to people like, Daryl Holiday, who's this amazing thought leader in the kind of community journalism space. Wanted to speak to, local journalists and journalists at the national level, and kind of try and just bring in other people's ideas. But the point of this it was never to get kind of submerged under their answers, right? The idea was to go into these interviews with my ideas, if not completely set in stone, of course, because these conversations can guide your thinking, and that was part of the point. But, it wasn't like I was going in with, I have no idea how I'm going to answer this question. I have no idea how I'm going to structure the book. I mean, I'd already written the proposal. It had already gone through peer review, if that's not too in the weeds to say, by the time that I came to interview people. So I knew what I was trying to say and what areas I was going to focus on. The idea of the interviews was then to kind of texture that, so it's not just my voice in the book, so that I can use voices from other people to support my argument, but also at times to disagree with it, right? Or to say, this is a perspective that this guy has that maybe I don't have, but it's an interesting different way of seeing it. It's kind of about, again, making that argument more textured, but it doesn't make it not an argument. It is my book and it is my answer. In terms of how I did the interviews, I tailored the questions to things I knew the other person would be in a good position to talk about. I think with my interviewees from Myanmar in particular, there was obviously a desire to kind of do more reporting in the sense of finding out what their experiences are like, what the kind of sweep of being quite a closed system to a more open one to closed again in terms of press freedom and other civil liberties has been like for them. It was maybe a bit more kind of factually guided than others where I knew what the kind of sort of factual background was a bit more. But that's not to say I didn't sort of get into the philosophical stuff with them. It just maybe was a different route in. One thing I did do is actually, I think I asked every interviewee, maybe not every single one, but I kind of tried to ask at least most of them, what is journalism for, as the first question of the interview. And I would say to people, this is an insane first question to ask. It's totally broad. And I'm not expecting you to give me a comprehensive kind of well thought through answer back. But I'm kind of interested where your brain goes. What's the first thing that you think of? And some people were like, I have no idea how to answer that question at all. And others just answered in these kind of paragraphs, just sort of instantly seemed to form in their head as if they were the ones who had been writing the book. But I think together, it was super useful. And there is a kind of mini section in the introduction to this book where I kind of juxtapose some of those, different answers. And there really are some quite different answers in there. So, it was definitely, I'm very glad that I did the interviews, that it's not just my voice coming through in the book. But I do want to stress that it's not like a conventional work of I'm just sort of standing back and having a neutral view on this. And these people can sort of duke it out in a way where I've chosen them to sort of be a scientifically representative sample. That's not really what we're going for here.
Yeah. And would it be fair, Jon, to sort of give someone who hasn't read the book an idea of what you're interrogating here, that you're interested in, I guess, a series of key relationships that journalism as it's practiced today has with democracy, we could call it power, I guess, also, with truth, and with community. And of course there are other things beyond that, but those are the sort of the architecture of the book is sort of interrogating those dynamics, I guess, power looking upwards to the sort of controlling context in which journalism is practiced and what it's interrogating, and then community, the relationships that the journalist has with people who hopefully will read what they have to say. Is that the sort of nub of your sort of exploration?
Yeah, because as I said, it's a really subjective question, and I don't claim to be able to offer some universal answer, or even that there is one. So it's not about kind of laying down if you do these 10 things, you have done a piece of journalism, or, if you follow these 10 reporting steps, you can call yourself a journalist, and otherwise you're not. In fact, I think the book in places is quite critical of this idea of gatekeeping journalism as a profession where you must have been to a trade school or have a license or whatever. It's much more kind of fluid and interwoven with society than that. And I guess, that sort of latter thing guided my approach. I think what I did was I sort of zoomed in on, if you read a lot of literature that's kind of at a high level about journalism, themes that come up repeatedly, right? So this idea that Journalism should be about telling the truth, obviously, or finding out what the truth is. This idea about community in journalism is super important in a lot of literature. And I tried to sort of say, yeah, these kind of are the pillars of like what journalism is for, but within them, there is actually quite a lot of complexity, right? Like this, so this idea that journalism should serve a community, for example, I think that's a very kind of often stated kind of truism of journalism. I think especially in the US, journalism should be rooted in community. It should be about serving a community. And I think, yes, that's true. But then what is a community? I mean, there's communities that are geographic. It's also communities that are ethnic or religious or, unite around the special interest. I once did a profile of a French magazine called Flush, which is about toilets, which aim to sort of like serve the community of people who, work in and think about toilets. And it was actually super interesting because it used toilets as a way to kind of assess big questions about the world in a way that was like, sounds totally silly when you say it, but actually makes a ton of sense if you think about it for longer than like 5 seconds. So, actually what community is complicated. And then I think you have the secondary question of like, what happens to the people outside the community if you're serving the people in the community? I mean, it can just be that that's your focus and that's fine because you don't report on the people in the next town over. But if your reporting is accidentally or intentionally worse, sort of, laying down narratives that make you hate the people in the town over or make you think it's kind of us against them and doesn't sort of start from the premise that, you have these kind of sub-communities, but actually today in this globalized world, we're all kind of one big community with these shared challenges. Like, how does that work? And, hating people in the town over might sound silly, but what if the community you're serving is conservatives, which is a thing that lots of media companies do? What if the community you're serving is liberals? What if you're trying to make those people hate the people who think differently to you? What if in the case of Myanmar, there are real issues about hate campaigns that can then spill over into real life? How is the media kind of complicit in those? I think they're very consequential questions. So it's kind of about interrogating those ideas, not denying that they sort of are what journalism is for, right? Journalism is for serving community. That's one of the pillars, I think, that makes it what it is. But again, within that, there's a lot of complexity. I think what was also interesting for me was to interrogate, and I hope this is sort of a key message of the book, is to sort of interrogate like journalism's place in wider society vis-a-vis other institutions, because I think that journalists can be tempted to see themselves as kind of heroes of their own narrative or as this kind of backstop when other institutions fail, which obviously, is a problem, particularly now in this world where so many institutions seem to be crumbling and in poor shape. How can we kind of fill the gaps, or how can we make society better? I think it's, about trying to say that because there is kind of an old-fashioned view in journalism. This is not journalism's job in the sense that it's unethical to do things like this. It's unethical to insert yourself into a community dispute over a, pipe issue in the street because you're a journalist. You should be covering it from an objective point of view. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think these things often actually can only really be worked out on a case-by-case basis as to how journalists should relate to them. But I certainly think that journalists are members of their communities and therefore have a stake in community problems. And shouldn't try to sort of hide that fact or wish it away. I just think that's impossible. But at the same time, though, saying that something, is compatible with what journalism is for isn't the same as saying that it is what it is for. And I think that there can be this kind of mission creep among some journalists in a very well-intentioned way that makes them start to think that they should be doing all these other kind of social functions that actually in a very ideally functioning society would fall to someone else, basically. It's not to say it's wrong to think about journalism in those terms per se, but it's to say that actually, those kind of core pillars that are about kind of scrutinizing and thinking about and reporting back how the world is are themselves really, really difficult, and society does need them. And whatever the outcomes that attach to that, unfortunately, that might not be something that's in your control. It doesn't mean that what you're doing is pointless or futile or that no one cares or that no one's paying attention. So I think it's about, yes, not just saying what journalism is for or what it could be for and how that's kind of nuanced. It's about trying to situate that within a broader social institutional picture, I hope.
Yeah. I mean, it's relatively easy to see why people in power might be suspicious of journalists. But why do you think journalism as a profession so often ranks very low in professions trusted by the public? Because, truth-telling, speaking truth to power, investigating, bringing things to light, they're all very noble aims. So is it that our conception of journalists is too broad and we extrapolate too much from the worst and the sort of tabloid foot in the door kind of journalism, and that sort of tarnishes the whole thing? I've always been a bit perplexed that journalism consistently seems to score, and I guess since Trump, weaponizing, mainstream media has almost, it's become a pejorative in some right-wing circles. So why, when all the things that, journalism at its best is trying to do seem so laudable and noble, why do they sit so low in the league table of trusted professionals?
I think that is an enormously complicated and difficult question. I think there's an enormous amount of hand-wringing going on about, like, why does no one trust us? And I totally understand why. I think the answers to that question are not going to be found in this book, per se. I think there are a number of things. I think that journalists in too many parts of the world are out of touch, are not, or historically have not been representative of the communities they're supposed to serve in terms of social class, in terms of, race, ethnicity, gender. It's very, very important to have newsrooms that do represent a community. For far too long, we know that has been a big failure. And still, actually, in the UK, for example, the statistics around the social class breakdown of people who work in national newsrooms are just horrifyingly unrepresentative. I mean, it really is a sort of profession that just does not have really any working class representation in it, hardly at all. So I think that there is that sense of kind of alienation and detachment, maybe. Clearly, there have been elite media consensuses around things that are very consequential that have been totally wrong and that have contributed to an erosion of trust. I mean, I think that it cannot be overstated how much the media cheerleading around the war in Iraq, not just cheerleading from an opinion side of things, by the way, but actually reporting things that were just wrong, damaged trust, right? When in the UK, maybe the media consensus is Brexit is never going to happen, and then it does happen, you can look like idiots. Obviously, that was not necessarily a media consensus across the whole sweep of, the ideological range of British publications, but I think at the sort of elite liberal media level, it probably was. So I think there's this sense of not being representative, not listening, getting things wrong. All those things are big problems, and I hope that a lot of what my work does is tries to interrogate those. I mean, the news media is not something that just should be trusted, right? It has to, I don't want to say earn trust, because that kind of implies that we're the only people who have control over this, which I'll come on to momentarily. I don't think that's the case, but but it kind of is true, right? We have to do things that at least merit trust. And yeah, I think that just sort of assuming that people should trust us because we know what's good for you, we know what the truth is, and we're telling you, that's not how journalists should think about their jobs. They should think about their jobs with way more humility than that. But then I think, again, and this is part of the book, journalists often like to think they can control things that they can't control. And when you have political movements that are using the elite media as a proxy for elites generally, right, when they are saying basically, at least implicitly, it's because of the New York Times and their fake news that your lives suck and that you're dissatisfied and that you feel angry. That is a weaponized movement of hatred that is coming from a very, very high place, the highest office in the US. Currently, the similar is true all around the world. That is enormously powerful and is very hard for journalists to combat, because part of the appeal of it is it kind of drags journalists into a necessarily adversarial posture where you have to fight back against it because you're under attack. If you don't fight back, you're patsies, basically. But if you do fight back, they can say, look at these people fighting us, they're total hacks, they're biased, etc., etc. They just hate me. By extension, because they hate me, they hate you. This is very hard to overcome. But to end on a more hopeful note, and I think you touched on this in the framing of the question, I also do think some of this data about trust in journalism being low should be taken with a pinch of salt. Because, or at least you should interrogate how the question was posed in an individual survey, what the media was defined as being. Because if you say to someone in the UK who is an avid Guardian reader, but absolutely loathes The Sun, the Daily Mail, right-wing tabloids that they see as gutter press who, violate people's privacy and are racist and all the rest of it, do you trust the media? If their mind, first of all, goes to The Sun and the Daily Mail and the gutter press, they will say no. That doesn't mean they don't trust the media, though, because they might trust the Guardian, the BBC, the Independent. They still, I think that actually is a person who probably has a quite healthy level of trust in media. And you could absolutely make the case the other way, right? If you hate the Guardian and people ask you, do you hate the media? And what you have in mind at that moment is this kind of part of the media that you do actually hate. You might say, yes, I do hate them. It's a hugely multitudinous category, in a way that I don't think is quite comparable to asking someone, do you trust lawyers or do you trust teachers, right? Like you might very well with those be thinking of an individual example of a person, so there might be that kind of aspect of selectivity, but I don't think it's quite the same idea as the media as a category, which is something that kind of looms over your head in a sense that it's not necessarily like you might know people in this profession, but is kind of coming at you from different ways and in very different ways. I just think that, yeah, those questions can be quite sweeping in a way that demands us to interrogate the data they pop out. I don't necessarily think the picture is always as bleak as those surveys suggest, but for the reasons I said earlier, I'm not denying it's a real problem. It clearly is a real problem. I just think the extent of it is something we need to be kind of open-eyed and open-minded about.
Yeah. You were talking about community a bit earlier, and I wondered how worrying is it? How worried should we be about the disappearance of local news, about local newspapers, how they're sort of hollowed out, how they're disappearing? That we see the job loss figures across the Western world for people in local newspapers. It seems to me that they're a really important part of the whole ecosystem in all sorts of ways for connecting community and making things in community apparent, even for things like training journalists, for journalists learning their trade on the ground and then perhaps ending up at a national paper or a specialist publication. So if we take that block out of the edifice, does it really have implications that go all the way up as well as at the grassroots level?
Absolutely. It's extremely concerning because it's kind of not just like taking one block out of a Jenga tower. It's like taking out the bottom blocks, right? Because so much national news is premised on knowing about what happens at lower levels in different communities, cities, towns around the country. Because if you don't know what's happening there, you can't necessarily build this national story. So yeah, it's kind of like undermining the whole edifice. If you take that block away, national news then becomes more premised not on people who are on the ground gathering facts in localities. I mean, some national publications are big enough to be able to afford to send people, but they won't always necessarily have the insight, and crucially, they won't always stay as long as people who actually live in that place and cover it for a local paper. So national news then becomes more nationalized in the sense that it's about national political issues that people in a capital city with political agendas are propagating. And then obviously, if you don't have robust local news serving communities, people are then consuming that news, and that colors the entire way they see the world, right? So they start to see things in terms of national political divides rather than this issue is happening in my town and I know about this in quite a nuanced way because there was this reporting which doesn't really actually have anything particularly to do with national level politics in a local paper that I subscribe to or pay for. And I think the US is a very good example of all the dynamics that I've just mentioned. It's obviously not to say that local news is totally dead. There are still local papers that do amazing work. There are increasingly kind of these non-profit startups that are kind of trying to fill the void a bit, but I think they're really not reaching people at the scale that local news used to reach people in the past. There has clearly been a huge diminution in local reporting resources, not just in the US, but in the UK and elsewhere. And yeah, it's fundamental. It really is a fundamental part of journalism. We need people with their eyes on their local government, on their local bin collection, because again, while it's not these journalists' responsibility to make these things work better, it is their responsibility to critique, to analyze, to report the truth about how they're working, why they might not be working as well as they can. And obviously that then serves as an accountability mechanism. There's pretty compelling evidence that when you take local news away in the US context, for example, local levels of corruption go up and local levels of service delivery go down because politicians realize they're not being watched. It is hugely, hugely important. And I think there is very clearly demand for it in the sense that people, I think, do want to know what's going on in their community. I think whether that translates into demand in the kind of economic sense, like I will pay for this and I will pay for this particular newspaper or website, is a totally different question. I think we have a real issue with that kind of economic side of things. And, I talk a bit towards the end of the book about how about some visions for how that could potentially work better or a direction of travel for that might work better. But there are no easy answers on that front. But I do think that people want this information, whether or not they say they trust journalists or whether or not they say they want it or whether or not they say they want to pay for it. Humans need information about the world going on around them. And the world is even, one street over from where I'm sat now is too big a place for me to be able to directly go and sort of experience that myself in a reliable way. We need people who can interpret that, tell us what's going on,
Yeah.
criticize it in the sense of thinking critically about it. It's hugely important, and the disappearance of it, is alarming.
Yeah,
For sure.
and of course, into that vacuum has rushed social media content, which may not be local news, and certainly won't be reported by a local journalist. But that thirst to know about the world beyond our own street can be full and is being fulfilled in other ways, and ways which I guess you and I might see as really quite detrimental to the health of democracy and all sorts of other things that we hold dear. But there are the TikTokification of what people consume by way of news. And I know there's a debate there. I know that there's some people doing interesting work on TikTok, but that curiosity that we have as human beings can be fulfilled by other means.
It can, and it's of enormous concern when that is concentrated across a relative handful of major digital platforms whose algorithms are controlled by unaccountable billionaires and are totally opaque, right? I mean, that is just very concerning. Like, we don't know why we're seeing what we're seeing. We have some good ideas, which are to do with how content that, spikes strong emotions like hatred and anger and fear does well algorithmically. We know that, but it's not sort of based on like any sense that at these very big social media companies there is transparency about why they're doing what they're doing, and Facebook can just turn around one day and say, well, actually news content isn't really popular with advertisers, or it's not really doing very well, so we're just going to kind of dial that down, and we're going to dial up pictures of your family and cats instead. I mean, that might be the kind of nicer end of the spectrum of the stuff they could be dialing up, but it still does. Newsrooms that build strategies around that then lose a load of money, and that clearly is, a problem that has seen whole newsrooms go bust, right? In addition to a bunch of journalists just losing their jobs generally. I do want to say though that I just think that social media is kind of a reality of the world we live in. Like, complaining about it as this kind of inherently dreadful thing for journalism and for people's ability to perceive the truth isn't going to make it go away. And it is also like a huge kind of arena where, there's competition for seeing, who you can reach. The things that cut through are not always the things that are the most truthful or in the public interest, but, to put it very mildly. But there is an opportunity for more voices to come through that way. And some of those can be responsible and they can do journalism. I think it is a very different world to the one where the mainstream media considered themselves to be society's informational gatekeepers to a much larger extent. But I think that saying that it's kind of inherently and in all ways worse than that is clearly not true, right? I think that those gatekeepers did not always act responsibly. They clearly represented, stratas of society that were very homogenous. Now, if you want to oppose the Iraq war because you see an elite media consensus that is cheerleading towards it, you can go and start a blog in the early 2000s, right? And that can kind of become quite influential. Now if you want to, draw attention to the war in Gaza or other things that you think the mainstream media is not covering well enough, you can go on TikTok and you can do it. It doesn't mean that you'll always be guided by a journalistic spirit or necessarily doing journalism, but you absolutely can be. Like, a point I make in the book, and this is borrowed from an American thinker called Hamilton Nolan, American journalist called Hamilton Nolan. It's, there isn't this kind of like, and it's a quote he actually, I think, wrote like a few years ago that has always stuck with me. There isn't this sort of priestly class of people who are journalists and everyone else is like the rabble receiving journalism. It's an act. If you do journalism, if you apply critical thinking and you sort of try and get to the truth and you're quite rigorous about it and responsible about it, you can do journalism. I mentioned in, obviously a good portion of the book is focused on Myanmar. Citizen journalism there has become enormously important because the professional journalists have been put in jail or driven out of the country, or they've quit their jobs. So you have, in many cases, civilians using their cell phones to document stuff in a way that feels very kind of like techno-optimisty and a bit kind of out of vogue for us who in the West who maybe sort of associate that with the Arab Spring, but then that all went wrong and actually this promise was completely unfulfilled. Well, no, actually in lots of parts of the world, this is actually still super, super important. It's not to say that there are not legitimate questions as to how those people are doing what they do. It's not to say they get everything right or that they're always responsible or that they don't even, on occasion make things up or push an agenda. It is a noisy and unregulated and difficult and random information environment that we're all in the world experiencing. But I don't think that means there are no opportunities within it for journalism to cut through. And I would just finish by saying quickly, if it's okay, that, especially in the US right now, there's a ton of hand-wringing about these kind of bro podcasters who allegedly now control the entire information landscape, and they're totally in Trump's pocket, and this is terrible. I think to a not insignificant extent, that analysis is true. I'm not trying to downplay the concern about it at all. I also think, though, that assuming that kind of one side has monopolized the information environment when they've won an election by 1.5% is an overreaction and is just kind of confirmation bias. But also, a lot of these podcasters, and even right-wing media figures, who otherwise spread disinformation or aren't responsible to the truth or don't even necessarily always talk about politics, they still have to talk about political information. They still have to talk about information that is basically true and has come from somewhere. I mean, maybe some of them just purely make things up, but actually the vast majority don't. They're reacting against things that they see in the mainstream media. Now, they might be doing it in a way that trashes the mainstream media, but they're still kind of acting on this like supply, this funnel of information about the world that is true. If that doesn't constitute a form of demand for journalism, even if it's one that's uncomfortable and difficult and doesn't translate into the resources we need to do our jobs, and even in many ways makes our jobs harder, it still is better than living in a world where like anything goes, where no one cares about fact at all, where everything is just kind of dead and there's no demand for journalism. Like, I think one thing I've learned doing this book and my CGR work is that I think there really actually is a demand for that basic act of like new factual information about the world. It just is kind of warped and looks different to how it maybe did in the past. And yeah, it's important that we kind of try and figure out how to make sure the good information that's responsibly put together reaches more people than the stuff that would distort it. But I think it's a nuanced and complicated picture, basically, maybe more so than some of the critics would attest, but still challenging for sure.
Yes, and when I heard that the Democratic governor of California had started a podcast and had Steve Bannon on, and hadn't pushed back when Bannon said that he said this several times, Trump won in 2020, I thought, oh dear, they've seen something in the media sphere. They're trying to replicate it, but actually this is probably not going to help.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is actually an interesting example. So Gavin Newsom, who is in many ways kind of the kind of archetype of a career politician, sort of coastal Democrat who is sort of supposed to be disdained by like real America these days. Yeah, started this podcast, which is like a long form interview show, clearly sort of trying to like get the Democrats into this lane where, Joe Rogan operates, or where the Republicans are perceived as having a huge advantage. And from what I've heard of it, the podcast itself is kind of a joke. I mean, as you say, he has on these right-wing figures in the name of, I guess, kind of debating with them, but actually he doesn't really debate. He just sort of asks them questions and then says, that's interesting, when they say things like the last election was stolen, right? Like it feels like a bit of a one-sided fight, which, given he's the host, is a bit weird. That being said, though, I think there is something interesting going on there as well, which is these shows are very long, right? Like Joe Rogan's podcast is very long. Gavin Newsom's podcast, you could question whether it's the best use of his time governing a state which has the, whatever biggest economy in the world, but it's pretty long, and at times it is actually substantive. There is a kind of exchange about issues, even if I think, again, he could be pushing back stronger on some blatant falsehoods. And I don't think we were starting from a point here where politicians were like maximally accessible or communicating with the media in a good way. And is there a case to be made that actually, compared to a world where politicians never speak to the public and hide behind carefully sculpted, focus grouped press releases and tweets and, never say anything of any interest, never try and engage their opponents really kind of directly, apart from like a debate once every 5 years, never say anything controversial? Is there a case to be made that these podcasts, even though they are a way of circumventing the sort of traditional news media as we understand it, are totally a bad thing? I don't know. I think actually maybe if this is a first step towards an understanding that politicians feel they can actually speak their minds more, that they can speak at greater length, that they can actually kind of engage with issues in a way that's like an hour and a half long and people will listen to it. Maybe that's kind of like a step away from the dumbing down of politics and this kind of disengagement with issues-oriented, policy-oriented media. Maybe. Again, that's quite a tentative conclusion, and I think what Newsom's doing and why it doesn't, in my opinion, really work is because he's taking that kind of spirit of don't embarrass myself apart from in ways where I maybe kind of want to put out a controversial thing as like a trial balloon or whatever, and sort of applying it to a format where that doesn't work. But I think if you sort of actually embrace the format a bit more, it's not entirely like an unhopeful thing. And like, I guess this is sort of like a side effect of Donald Trump, who has obviously been bad for the media and press freedom in so many ways that are, hard to sort of sit here and enumerate. I think what he has done, though, is broken the idea that to win in politics, you have to be this kind of corporate suit who focus groups within an inch of its life every single thing that you say, that you can. And I guess it's the irony with Trump because he actually doesn't tell the truth very often. But at least if you sort of appear to tell the truth, or you appear like you're speaking your mind, that people actually kind of like that. If that can unlock, in other people, a sense that actually, yeah, maybe I will do a podcast, or maybe I'll go and talk to this journalist for an hour and a half and trust them to sort of like kind of boil down the nuance of what I'm saying, or at least I don't really care if they don't because it's not going to make or break my career. Maybe that's sort of stepping into a new political era, and in terms of political messaging and communication, at least, and maybe that place just isn't quite as bleak as it might seem. Again, challenging certainly for traditional journalists, but like, I don't think we're coming from a place where everything worked really well, is I guess what I'm saying, and there are opportunities in this new information landscape that we're stepping into, I think.
Yeah. So to round things off, John, I mean, the headwinds do seem to be considerable, and they seem to be blowing a lot stronger since Trump 2.0 came back. But would you say the message that you would want to leave with the reader is that we are, despite those challenges, the media landscape is evolving and it will find new forms, and some will persist and some will change, but we shouldn't sort of catastrophize and think that we're living through the era of the death of journalism. There is actually hope, even if the landscape in 10 years' time looks very different from it did 10 years ago and even from today.
I think there's a more hopeful and a less hopeful answer to this question, and I think both are true and important. As I hope I demonstrate in the book, I think journalism is essentially important to society. I think it's part of governance, or like this, like, how society kind of regulates itself. And I think if it were to completely die and go away, that would be terrible. It would be the equivalent of getting rid of, healthcare or other public services that we've come to rely on. And yeah, it's a very, very bleak landscape for it out there. It is in inexorable, seemingly economic decline, with a few exceptions of outlets that have managed to kind of reach a particular audience and therefore monetize that. But, in general terms, there is just not enough of it, especially at the kind of smaller grassroots level where it's really, really important. It is under full frontal attack. Democracy and civil liberties, including freedom of the press, are eroding in so many places around the world, including the US, which, having this conversation 15 years ago, actually maybe some of the seeds for what's happening in terms of attacks on the press now would have been apparent, but it's really been an accelerated timeline of how acceptable it has become to kind of go after the press, not just rhetorically, but also now in regulatory ways, through spending cuts, if you're talking about things that are publicly funded, through lawsuits, that kind of thing. Lawsuits get more and more outlandish. It is really, really difficult, and it is bleak, and I don't want to sort of sugarcoat this with false hope. I don't think journalists should do that, as I actually say in the book about about kind of any topic. And I think that there is a profound, and I don't think it would be a total exaggeration to use the word existential crisis around how journalism is paid for. There does not appear to be a reliably money-making commercial model for journalism that will produce it at a scale and in the public interest enough to kind of, work across the whole of society, certainly not in a way where it's also then available to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay for it. I think we need to be exploring public media options, publicly funded media options, especially in the US, but also here and elsewhere, a lot more than we are. But, the rejoinder to that it's difficult to criticize people who pay your paychecks, or that, Trump and Elon Musk type people could just come in and cut the money. Yeah, of course, those are weighty considerations. That being said, and I guess I'll finish on the more hopeful answer, there are, even now, movements in Democratic-run states in particular in the US to do more when it comes to publicly supporting journalism. And that doesn't necessarily entail handing over money. It might be doing a training program for journalists who then go and work for news organizations that's publicly funded. It might be tax credits, so that if you have a certain number of subscribers, they can claim a tax credit on the paper subscription and you can claim a credit on them, or whatever. These things were, I don't want to say unthinkable, but these were not popular ideas 10 years ago when, I think the idea, or maybe even longer, when the idea that journalism should be like a purely market enterprise in the US and the government shouldn't get involved at all, and that's totally taboo. I think that taboo is being broken, actually, and I think it's happening at levels that are below what is kind of the most visible stuff, but that is still serving quite a lot of people, actually, or in states that have a lot of people in them. Again, that is not a substitute for this happening at kind of national levels or at scale, but it is a seed of hope, as are alternative business models where people are working out ways to, have non-profit journalism that reaches people, or get sort of fuse journalism into the community so that members of the community are kind of doing journalism themselves. Again, I want to be very clear, these things are not yet happening at a scale that is needed to replace what is being lost. Absolutely not. And that is a huge, huge challenge. But, I think there are ideas out there. I also think society needs journalism. Whether society thinks it hates journalism, I sort of touched on this earlier, it just does need it. Like, I just think that it cannot survive without it. That is not the same as saying society needs legacy media, large newspapers, cable news networks, and that these things will somehow kind of be preserved in aspic forever in the current form, and that traditional journalism with its ethical codes and its kind of norms will persist forever. It is absolutely not about that. A lot of these places are in existential trouble, but something is going to replace that stuff or kind of texture it, because that kind of act of needing to know things about the world and to have people who think critically about it on your behalf is, I think, an essential human need. Now, I think there's, again, a very real chance that if we get into a situation where we don't know how to pay people to do that in a way that's rigorous, then that's a huge, huge problem. But it doesn't mean the need isn't there. It doesn't mean that we don't have the tools to meet that need. It doesn't mean, we live in a world where, journalism is in decline, but information is as available as it's ever been, or much more so. You have information that is extraordinarily available. The local paper in a small town in Idaho might have died. And that's terrible for the people who live there, and also for people who want to find out information about that town. It makes it, a news desert. But the paper the town over might be thriving, a non-profit, and I, sitting in London, could go and look at the website and read all about this small town in Idaho that, 40 or 50 years ago, unless something caught the eye of a national journalist that then got into a print newspaper that then was read out on air, and I consumed it that way. I mean, I have an extraordinary ability to see that. It's actually completely phenomenal. So, the internet is challenged and basically broken in many ways the commercial business model for journalism, but it's also a huge opportunity to get and share information for different perspectives, for different voices to come across. We're not living in a world where these things are inherently or inevitably shutting down. I think this is a moment of, it's a moment of crisis, no question about that, but out of crisis, often it makes you do the hard thinking, it makes new things be born. And when that need is there to carry over from the period of crisis to the next thing, I'm confident that journalism will survive. What it looks like, I don't know. And unfortunately, you won't find the answer in the book. But hopefully what you will find is an argument as to why it will survive, why it's so needed, why it's a public good.
Jon, thank you very much for appearing today on Transforming Society.
Thank you so much for having me.